As we look at functions, the next thing I want to dig into is how to use multiple input parameter groups with Scala functions. And I currently describe this best in my book, Learn Functional Programming the Fast Way. So I'm going to start with the lesson here, and then we'll jump into the REPL to see how this works. As you can see from the title here, in Appendix H of my book, I cover call by name parameters. And as part of this, I cover multiple parameter groups. So I want to take a look at what I show here. Skipping call by name parameters, this example shows how to define a function with multiple input parameter groups. This is a plain Scala function named sum, and it just happens to have two input parameter groups. So it has this input parameter group here, where I have an input parameter named a, and it's an int. And instead of defining b as a second input parameter in that group, what I do here is I define that as a separate group. So b is another input parameter. It's also an int. Then over here, the function returns an int, and then you can see the body of the function just sums those two values, a and b. So I can copy this here, and then paste that into the REPL. And now you can see we just use this like a normal function, except that instead of having one input parameter group like that, it has a second input parameter group. So we do that, and then you can see the result of that is 3. So it's just a sum function. It's a very simple function, but I use two input parameter groups. And just to be clear, what I'm talking about here is if I did not want two input parameter groups, I would just do one like this. So this is the sort of function signature I will assume that you're used to seeing. And I had never seen multiple input parameter groups in my life until I started working with Scala. And I was like, good gosh, why in the world are they doing that? But anyway, getting back to this example here, that's a normal sum function that you're used to seeing. And again, I'll pass in the two input parameters, and you see the sum of that is 3. But then if we go back to this one that has two input parameter groups, then we use that like this. Now, to understand why this is useful, we have to take a look at call by name parameters. And so in Scala, we define a call by name parameter like this. And as the code shows, what I'm doing, this is a normal function, so I'm defining a function with the def keyword. The function name is exec right there. And what I'm doing is I'm taking in one input parameter, and it's called block of code. And this is different than taking in other input parameters, which you can tell by this part of the signature. So this part right here means, and the block of code name helps, so this means I'm taking in a block of code that someone is going to pass in, and that block of code doesn't require any input parameters, and it's going to return the unit type here. And here I show that you can get into different signatures, but I just want to keep this simple for right now. So I will copy that and then paste that in. So this is going to be a function named exec. And the way you use this now is you pass in some sort of block of code. And the only requirement of the block of code is that it takes in no input parameters, and then it returns unit. And then I show some examples on this next page. So you can see here that you can pass exec any block of code that has the unit return type. So one example is calling println. So I could say exec, and again, that's the name of the function. I'm going to put a space here just to give a little more room and make this a little more obvious. And then I could pass in hi like that. And because println is a function that returns the unit type, I can pass it in here and it will work. So what happens here is I pass in println into this function, and then nothing happens right away, and then block of code is executed here. So this section right here is saying run this parameter. So basically, exec is taking in the block of code, and then the first line right here says run that block of code when you get here. And because exec will execute anything that returns unit, I could also pass in something else like print. So again, that works just fine. And a fun thing here, I didn't plan on getting into this much in this video, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. Fun thing here is that you can have other code in here. So you can have a comment and whatever else you need here. So we could just do a println. Yeah, we could println, how about just 42 right there, and then run block of code. So again, this code doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I'm just trying to show an example here. And now we can go back up to here. Either one of these is fine, but I'll go back up to here and run this one. And now we'll see println of 42 happen first, and then the block of code is executed second. And you see that right there. So again, this isn't a particularly useful example, but it is simple, and that's a great benefit for where we are right now. And now another thing I show in the book is right here, and this turns out to be very important. So in Scala, you can pass in a multi-line block of code that's enclosed in curly braces. So this will work. If I can copy and paste that into the REPL, I can demonstrate that. And that does work. Sometimes it's hard to copy and paste for PDFs, but that did work. So here I'm calling my exec function, and what's happening here, and hopefully I mentioned it earlier in this course, is that anything enclosed in these curly braces is just a block of code. What I call a block of code, I think other people call it a closure, and there's probably other names for it, but I'm just going to call it a block of code to keep it simple. And this little block of code, all I do is I assign 42 to this variable right there, and then I print that right here. So this block of code is getting passed into exec. So when I hit enter, you'll see that right there. So I hope that makes sense, because this is a key part of starting to understand things in Scala. And again, I'm way past a beginner's course right now. I didn't plan on showing you this much, but since I'm here, I thought I might as well. And if you're interested here, as I scroll through the book, I show another example. So this is a block of code that returns the int type. And so what I do in this version of an exec function is I print that I'm about to run the code. This is really cool here because this says run this block of code and assign the result of it to this variable result, and then print that result here. So I'm not going to show that. I could show it right here where I execute 2 plus 2. So I pass in 2 plus 2 as a block of code and it runs it. And you can see that output. So it's about to run the block of code and then it runs it and returns that result right there. And I guess since I'm here, I'll keep going. Because exec takes any block of code that yields an int, as I mentioned right here, any block of code that yields an int, you can also pass in other functions to it. So here I define a function named sum, and it takes in 2 integers and adds them. So then you can pass sum into exec here because it's a function that returns an int. And I probably should have shown that int type right there to make that more obvious. And then I also show a multiply function, and then I pass multiply into exec. So that's the usefulness of a function like exec, is you can pass in anything to it that returns an int. And now, getting to my point, this code right here shows the importance of what we can do when we accept a block of code. So I call this function double if. So this is showing how it's used, and in a few moments I'll show how it's defined. And once you get experience with Scala, you can tell that this guy is now taking multiple input parameter groups. So this is the first input parameter group. This is the second input parameter group. And then it takes a third input parameter group here as another block of code. So I haven't shown 3 input parameter groups yet, but when you read this, you can see it that way. One group, second group, and then the third group is this block of code right here. And as you can see from this example, this lets you write what appears to be your own control structures in Scala. And now I do some discussion here about how to define this. And what I note here is that you can look at this code and you can see this is a test condition, right? That's an if-else type of condition, or the important part is it returns a Boolean. So however you want to define that, you can say it's a test condition, but the important thing is this returns a Boolean and this guy returns a Boolean. So you could think of this as being a block of code which returns a Boolean. And that's the first input parameter group right there. Then the second input parameter group also transforms a block of code into a Boolean. So that's the second group. And then kind of as a little test here in the book, I ask, what do you think this third one is? And that third one is this block of code right here. And hopefully from what you saw earlier, you could say, oh, okay, Al, I see that's a block of code. It only has this print line statement here, so it must be something that returns the unit type. And indeed, that's what I show here. The third parameter group, it takes a code block and it transforms that into a unit, or you can say it returns the unit type. And a cool thing is that we created our own control structure in Scala called double if, and it works just like this right here. So we have the function name, the 3 parameter groups right there. This double if function returns unit. And then the body of the function says, if test1 is true and test2 is true, then run this block of code or execute this block of code. And another cool thing about this that I'm kind of glossing over is if these are false, like if test1 is true but test2 is false, then this block of code won't be run at all. And that's really cool. So you're passing in a block of code like this, and that's not run at all unless these 2 test conditions are true. And that has to do with this being a call by name parameter. And I get into that more in this book, but the key is what I just mentioned. You're passing in a block of code and it's not executed until you call it. And when you use it with test conditions like this, it may never be called. So this is how you define it. And just to wrap this up, I will copy that, paste it into the REPL. And then what do I do here? We can just copy and paste all that to start with. I'll just type that in so we can see it in real time here. So double if, so I'm calling my function, passing it if the age is greater than 18 and number of accidents equals 0, then print line, you get a discount. And cool, you see how that works. And just to show how it doesn't work, gosh, I'm going to show one more thing here. Let's see if I can do this in the REPL here. So what I want to do is say print line, you entered double if. So I update that function. And now we can run that. And you see you enter double if, and then you get that print line of this block of code here, which is what I want to show. And then one other thing I want to show is I need to change those variables. Let's just do this. If how about 15? So I'll just do that just because I don't want to change the age variable. And now I do that. And you can see that you enter double if is printed right here. And then this line of code doesn't execute. So it says if test1, so I'm sorry, I should have mentioned earlier, T1 stands for test1, T2 stands for test2. So if test1 is true and test2 are true, then execute the block of code. And what happens here is test1 is not true. So block of code is never run. And so I got into an awful lot more here than I planned on doing. I really just wanted to show how to use multiple input parameter groups like this one and this third one. But to me, it almost doesn't make sense trying to explain multiple input parameter groups unless you show an example like this with call by name parameters. So that's why I got into all of this. And as a quick summary, if you ever need to define multiple input parameter groups in Scala, this first sum example gives you an idea of how to do that as a simple example with just variables. Then this example shows how to use sum. This example with exec showed how to run a block of code that returns a unit data type. And then up here I showed this example. And this one uses 3 input parameter groups. The first 2 parameters here are test conditions. So that's test1 returns a Boolean, test2 returns a Boolean. And then code block is the input parameter in the 3rd input parameter group. And it's the block of code that's run here if and only if test1 and test2 are true here.